This is Commissioner Kochmeyer. Is anyone else on? Yes. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Holzman's here. Good morning.
This weekend, so try to sleep through straight days.
Oh, that sounds lovely.
Here.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
I don't believe we've heard Commissioner Roop yet.
Commissioner Roop's here.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
All right, so we have all assembled, and it is now 10:15, so we'll go ahead and call the agenda meeting to order. Ask those participating on the call, please mute your phone unless you need to speak. So today we have 5 tariffs and new orders, and then we also have a presentation from MISO, who is with us in the room today. So we'll go ahead and get to it. First order of business is to approve the minutes from August 10th agenda. You all have seen those. Are there any additions or corrections? All right, hearing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes from August 10th say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those minutes are approved 5-0. First up on tariffs and new orders, file number WM 2022-0246. This is in the matter of the application of Rex Defender for Enterprises, Inc., DBA RDE Water Company, for authority to sell certain water assets in the city to the city of Nixa, and in connection therewith certain other related transactions. So RDE filed for authorization to sell its assets to the city of Nixa and for cancellation of its CCN, which we had granted earlier. Staff and OPC each filed a recommendation to approve the sale. So this order approves the sale, cancels the CCN, and provides a waiver of the 60-day notice requirement. So with that, I recommend we approve this order version 1. Commissioner Roop?
I am supporting the order.
Commissioner Coleman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Holzman?
I support the order.
And Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
And I'm in support as well.
All right, all those in favor of approving the order as drafted version 1 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That order is approved 5-0. Next up, file number WM 2022-0186. This is in the matter of the application of Foxfire Utility Company for authority to transfer certain water and sewer assets located in Stone County to Ozark Clean Water Company, and in connection there with certain other related transactions. So this order adopts the joint proposed procedural schedule for the parties, which includes an evidentiary hearing scheduled for October 24th and 25th. I recommend that we approve this order version 1. Commissioner Roop?
I am supporting this order.
Commissioner Coleman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Holzman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
I support the order.
All right, all those in favor of approving the order as drafted version 1 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That order is approved 5-0. Next up, file number WR 2022-0303. This is in the matter of Missouri American Water Company's request for authority to implement general rate increase for water and sewer service in its Missouri service areas. Again, this order just adopts the joint procedural schedule for the parties, which includes an evidentiary hearing scheduled for February 27th through March 10th of next year. So this order directs any party wishing to file its own discrete adjustments or oppose Missouri Americans as requested by OPC. So with that, I recommend that we approve this order, version 1.
I am in support of the order.
Commissioner Coleman.
I support the order.
Commissioner Holzman.
I support the order.
Commissioner Kolkmeyer.
And I do as well.
All right, all those in favor of approving the order as drafted version 1 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
That order is approved 5-0. Next up, file number EO 2022-0061. This is in the matter of the application of Evergy Missouri West, Inc., DBA Evergy Missouri West, for approval of a special high load factor market rate for a data center located in Kansas City. This order finds that the compliance tariff sheets Evergy West filed are in compliance with the second amended report and order issued in this case and allows them to take effect on August 28th. So I recommend that we approve this order version 2. Commissioner Roop?
I am supporting this order as well.
Commissioner Coleman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Holzman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
And I support the order.
All right, all those in favor of approving the order as drafted version 2 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
That order is approved 5-0. Final order today is file number GR 2022-0179. This is in the matter of Spire Missouri, Inc., DBA Spire's request for authority to implement a general rate increase for natural gas service provided in the company's Missouri service areas. This order sets 2 in-person and 1 virtual public meeting, public hearing for this case in October. So I recommend that we approve this order version 1. Commissioner Roop?
I am in support.
Commissioner Coleman?
I support the order.
Commissioner Holzman?
I support the order and continued support for virtual hearings for the customers.
Thank you. Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
And I support the order.
All right, all those in favor of the order as drafted version 1 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
And that order is also approved 5-0. So that concludes reports and orders. As I mentioned, we do have another discussion today for a presentation from MISO, who is in the room. So please join us at the table. And then, commissioners, you should have copies of PowerPoint that were emailed to you to follow along with.
Yeah, well, thanks.
All right, welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a while since I've been back to Jeff City, so I appreciate being here. I'm going to provide you today a little bit of an update on resource adequacy. It's been sort of the topic that we've been talking about among the stakeholders and the processes since our last planning resource auction. And I felt it was important to have that conversation in Missouri, given where we are with our resource adequacy situation. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the planning resource auction that just occurred, provide you a little bit of an overview of what our our resource adequacy construct is, and then talk about kind of a future look at resource adequacy and kind of where we're headed. So if you go to the first slide, this is just an overview of our resource adequacy construct. So we have a requirement, a planning year that goes from June 1st to May 31st. So we just started the 22-23 planning year back on June 1st. Folks can meet their resource adequacy requirements a number of ways. They can own their own resources and meet that requirement. They can do bilateral contracting to meet the requirement, or they can participate in our planning resource auction. Our planning resource auction occurs a couple months before the planning year, so it happened in April of this year. And really what the resource auction is supposed to do is balance the requirements of balance a portfolio of buyers and sellers. But it's really not meant to have all your resource requirements in it. It's really around the edges. So it's kind of a balancing market. It does include a locational requirement. As you can see here, Missouri in the Ameren footprint and is really in zone 5. And that's where you're located, but we have a locational requirement, which means you have to keep a certain amount of resources based on transmission constraints in your zone. And if there are insufficient resources to meet demand in the auction, the resource adequacy may not be achieved. So that's kind of one of the characteristics of the auction itself. So if you go to the next slide, we had a capacity resource auction, as I mentioned, in April. And really what it showed was the results point to that acceleration in the fleet retirements that we've been seeing and the fleet changes, and in that increasing risk profile as we become more closer to our planning reserve margin. We actually did not meet our planning reserve margin requirement, which is the peak load plus the reserve margin in zones 4 through 7. They actually had to import capacity to meet that requirement. We cleared the auction in the north and central regions, which are the regions in green above the 1900 megawatt transfer that you see in the middle of that map, at what we call the cost of new entry, or cone. And that was cleared at $236.66 a megawatt day. So that is the highest price that it could clear at, and that's because we were deficit of our requirement and our shortfall of about 1,230 megawatts for the north central regions. We did transfer we have a constraint from south to north, as you're well aware, and we transferred about 1,900 megawatts from the south to the north, which was the maximum. And we did import from external resources and still cleared that requirement. What that means is, instead of a loss of load expectation of 1 day in 10 years, we're at 1 day in 5.6 years. I will mention that this does not mean that grid reliability is at risk for sure. MISO is highly capable of managing the supply and load balance, even if supply is deficit. It does not mean that load shed is going to happen this year, but it does indicate that we're below reserve limits to which we collectively plan for the region. What it kind of does mean is that we'll likely implement emergency conditions more often, and so that we can access resources at the top of the supply stack that require emergency declarations in order to access them. So kind of taking a forward look, which is the next slide. Every year, and you're probably well aware of this, that MISO partners with the Organization of MISO States, or OMS, to conduct a voluntary survey of all load-serving entities and generation owners covering a 10-year period, but we focus on really the next 5 years. The results are represented in what we call UCAP, which is the unforced capacity. So it measures the unit's availability. This is the results of the survey for next year, the 2023-2024 planning year. The black bar represents our planning resource margin requirement for each zone. That green bar that you see is what load-serving entities and generators told us was the capacity that would definitely be available next year. And the blue bar represents potential new capacity that is in our generation interconnection queue. And that yellow bar, what the yellow is what could be, may or may not be available. So that's resources that people think may retire. Potentially, they haven't made the decision yet. I've circled Zone 5, which is Missouri. And as you can see, consistent with what we saw this year for 22-23 PRA, the Missouri zone will need to import resources from other zones in order to make up its PRMR. So it doesn't have resources sufficient in the zone, even with the new resources, to meet the planning reserve margin requirement projected at this point in time for next year. So the next slide shows you 27-28, so a 5-year look. It's a very similar look. We were going to have to rely on these new resources to actually come online in order for the region to be sufficient. So those blue bars will have to materialize for the region to be sufficient. And again, Zone 5 is showing that even with the new resources, which are primarily wind and solar, it will have to rely on its neighbors to meet its overall planning resource margin requirement based on the survey results. So what does all of this mean, and why are we seeing sort of this happening? So if you go to the next slide, so the PRA results in the OMS MISO survey are one of several indicators that there's a concern about energy sufficiency going forward. The ongoing portfolio changes require us to think and plan and act sort of differently than we have in the past. What this chart is showing is our installed and accredited capacity over the next 20 years, and it's based on the summation of our members' plans that we do in the regional resource assessment. So we have surveyed what our members say they're going to do for the next 20 years, and we've collected all of that information and try to figure out if we see any gaps. And so just just to make sure I can explain the difference between installed and accredited capacity. So the gray line that you see there is your installed capacity, and that's the nameplate of a generator. So it's what it can generate at its maximum output under ideal conditions for the system. And then what you see right there in the yellow bar with the yellow highlighted red bar is the accredited capacity. So this really shows you things like if there's a boiler leak on a coal plant, it can't generate its nameplate capacity. If there's not a lot of wind turbines can't generate, or if there's sun or snow, or if there's a lack of sun or a snow-covered solar panel, it can't generate. So we look at accreditation in this probabilistic, and it's based on operating history of what a particular generator is likely to be able to generate during the time it's most needed. So that number becomes its units accredited capacity, which you can see. So what you're seeing here is it's sort of flat in the near term, but the accredited capacity is sort of declining over time, even though your installed capacity is increasing over time. And what that really shows you is the new resources that are coming online don't have as much capacity value as the ones that you're retiring. I mean, that's so wind and solar, wind gets about a 15% capacity credit off its nameplate capacity, and solar gets about a 50% right now, down to sometimes a 35%. So in the summer. So that's really what's driving that line down as we see more wind and solar coming online. And you can see the other two lines represent our futures. So future one is the green dotted line, or the line in the bottom, the dotted line that shows that's what we project our load plus our planning reserve margin to be going out in the future. And then if we have high electrification, you can see future 3, which is the line above it, which at the very top, which shows you what it could be if electrification takes off in the next 20 years, what we might see. And so you can see here we have a big gap, and that's why you might hear us talk about mind the gap. That is the gap between the installed capacity and the accredited capacity is what the gap that we're talking about, that we're concerned about going forward. So the next slide just shows you a graphic, and you've probably seen this a few times, but of our generator interconnection queue. And so it just further shows what we see coming online in the future, and what our resource mix is trending toward. So you can see here that we have primarily solar in the queue down below there at 62%. And we have some wind, storage, and hybrid resources as the primary resources in the generator queue. And what you don't see is a lot of gas generation. That's the blue. And that blue shows about 4 gigawatts only coming online out of the whole 124.2 gigawatts of generators in the interconnection queue. So in Missouri, just to give you some context, there's about 7,000 megawatts of generators in your queue in Missouri right now. About 50% of that is solar. And you've got some wind and some hybrid and some storage. You do not have any currently gas generators in the interconnection queue in Missouri today. But this highlights why we were seeing that gap, is because those resources are not accredited at the same levels as your traditional resources, your gas and coal or nuclear, or even hydro resources. So that's why we see that gap sort of trending and going forward. And so just want to summarize what we think we're going to go from here. So one of the last slide that I wanted to show you is we think we need to work with everybody to sort of address this issue, from states and members, and then also what we need to be doing. So we think our states need to factor in some of the resource adequacy considerations that you're seeing here across regions and across different companies inside the state. And also we didn't talk a lot about attributes, but resource attributes are becoming more and more important. So what can a resource do, and what are we retiring? Are we retiring flexibility? Are we retiring ability to ramp up quickly? What are those attributes that we need, that we should be looking at in integrated resource plans when you get them from your members? And then members need to be looking not just at themselves and their individual resource decisions, but how their collective actions are going to happen, what's going to happen to resource adequacy based on their collective actions. MISO can enhance some of that transparency through the surveys we're doing, through the RRA. We did a RIA, or a integration of renewable studies. So all of that is what we're trying to do to increase that transparency, so you can see across all the regions what's happening. And we also need to advance our resource adequacy construct as best we can. So we need to really look at how we're going to deal with the real life impacts of all these changes that we're seeing in the resource fleet, and make sure we're making changes to the resource adequacy construct in a way that protects the end-use customers, and so that we have enough for reliability. So that's sort of what we're doing. We're actually taking on a lot of different projects in our market redefinition to address these issues, and they're ongoing through the stakeholder process. But I wanted to give you guys just an overview of where your state was landing with everybody else, because I think one of the concerns that we're hearing more and more is just this inability to, a lot of retirements. We got a lot of retirements in Missouri. I think Merrimack retired this year. I think Rush Island, which I think you're going to have a conversation about, is scheduled. And we just don't see a lot of replacement of that capacity coming online in Missouri. We see a lot of solar and wind. So just the gap between those issues, I think, is something for the commission to think about. So I'll pause. I'm sorry I talked so long, but open to take any questions that you might have.
Can we get that back up on the screen? There's a slide I wanted to go back to if we could. I don't have it in front of me, or I would. Let's go to that.
Second slide.
Next.
Third slide.
Next. Okay, so right there,
Yep.
that slide is showing the gap. Zone 5 it's just Missouri. right?
Yeah, Zone 5 is just Missouri.
Zone 5 is just Missouri. So when I'm looking at that one, I see Zone 5, Zone 4,
And
Zone
Zone
6
6.
all
Yep.
have gaps.
And that's what
And-
happened in 22 as well.
And the other gaps are bigger than ours.
That's right.
But then go to the next slide. 5 years down the road, everyone has surpassed their gap,
That's right.
except we have barely moved.
That's correct, because you don't have a lot of you have more retirements coming. So it's hard to see here, but your green bar got smaller. And that's basically because you're retiring another coal plant in the fleet. And your blue bar is getting barely bigger because you don't have a lot of resources scheduled to come online with the same capacity kind of accreditation going forward.
So it's an issue of accredited capacity versus nameplate capacity.
That's correct.
Of what's coming online.
Right.
Okay, so last week there was a resource adequacy summit. I think it was hosted by OMS.
Yep.
And the market monitor basically called out Missouri as a problem child in this whole
Yep.
deal. So what can the commission do?
So here's the only thing that there are players that you regulate, like Ameren, and then there are other players that you don't, which is and that's part of the gap too in the states. They say we don't regulate our munis and co-ops, and if they're having a problem, we can't do anything about it. So, but for the folks you regulate, just making sure that when you look at you do integrated resource plans in Missouri, right? Just to make sure that they're covering their load with their resources and replacing resources that they're retiring with some attributes and some resources that can actually get capacity credit and function and meet the requirements that are going forward is probably what you can do for your regulated utility. I think it's more challenging for those that you don't regulate because not everybody, and I think we have a responsibility as MISO to partner with states to show those folks what their situation is and what their load resource balance is. And we're putting in the 50% minimum capacity offer obligation if FERC accepts that. So that's something we're doing to help out. I think we're also looking at other changes to the resource adequacy contract that might help incent people to cover their load. The slip demand curve is something that the IMMs have been talking about for 14 years, I think. So it's something that would have capacity prices be higher and show that you were coming to a shortage, and the folks that didn't have enough capacity would have to pay that. So it's kind of an incentive to do something different. So I think a couple of those things might be helpful that we're doing too, because we know that the states can't regulate all the companies in your state. So when we're looking at the IRPs, we need to pay special attention to the accredited capacity. That's correct.
Of replacement, as opposed to just what the nameplate capacity.
Yeah, the accredited capacity, and I would say the attributes of that capacity. Like, what can it do? What are you retiring, and what can the new capacity do to fill the same attributes? Like, can it run 4 hours straight? Can it ramp up when you need it? Is it flexible? I mean, so some of the stuff that you're retiring and what you're bringing online would be important. And usually that kind of has a higher accredited capacity too.
Okay. Any other commissioners on the line have questions?
I just have a question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
So when you look at having solar and wind be the predominant backfill for the lost capacity from the retired coal plants, what can be done in terms of storage investment that would treat that new power in a way that could potentially be counted towards this capacity?
Yeah, so you do have some what I call hybrid, which are solar storage combinations and just storage itself in there, which is helpful because it has a short. It will help store the power and be able to produce power when the solar or the wind is not there. So the storage plus a wind and solar A combination would get a higher capacity credit. I think one of the challenges with the storage as it is today is it's not a long-term battery. It's really like a 4-hour duration, so it's good for short-term events. So if you have a drop in wind that's fast, you can use the storage to ramp back up. What it can't do today, which is needed as a longer duration event. So part of the problem is if you have a Uri again, and it's 4 or 5 days of no wind output or no solar output, the battery can only be there for 4 hours. So it can't have the same attributes, and that's why attributes are so important as other resources can. And so it will help its capacity credit to have storage with it, but I'm not sure it's going to be all you need to cover periods when you don't have Mother Nature providing you wind and solar.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I know this is a tough question, but we're going to have to figure out how we can meet both of these, the capacity requirement and the need to reduce our carbon emissions. So I appreciate the information.
Absolutely. And just so you know, I think when we think about gas units, because right now we don't have hydrogen and we don't have long-term battery, those things might come in the future and they might be helpful to us in sequestration and stuff to reduce our carbon footprint. One of the other things that's kind of important to understand is traditional gas units now are going to look much different tomorrow than they do today, because you're going to have all this wind and solar on the fleet. They're not going to run very often. So they're going to be short duration, not running full out like they might today with low gas prices when they were running with low gas prices. We're going to need them for incremental periods of time, but their profiles are going to be much different than what we see today, and they're going to run much less, which means that their emissions are not going to be as high.
So more like a peaker instead of a base.
Correct. Right. So when people are thinking about looking at gas facilities today, really they have to be looking at a 15% capacity factor, running 15 to 20% versus 95% or 90% or 85%. It's going to be a totally different profile because we have so much wind and solar on the system.
Commissioner, any other questions? Any other commissioner have questions? I think in the room, Walt indicated, do you have a question, Walt?
I do. Thank you.
Yeah.
Melissa, you touched on resource attributes changing,
Yep.
and that's becoming something. I don't really think we're familiar with what that means.
Okay.
And one of those attributes that has been coming along, you sort of touched on retirements of large coal plants.
Yep.
And that has something to do with frequency control.
Yep.
And so could you kind of give us an explanation of that?
Yeah. So when I talk about attributes, and just so you know, we're still defining which attributes we need now versus what we can wait on. Frequency is one of them because our large coal plants provide a lot of frequency and voltage support to the system. So there are attributes like that we're looking at. I think some of the more near-term attributes are things like ability to ramp quickly over 4 hours when we lose large wind and solar facilities, ability to stay online over long duration events and have fuel to be able to do that. So I think right now we have a litany of attributes that we're kind of looking at. I think in the stakeholder process, and we have a workshop coming up in September, so we're going to talk about the attributes. I think we're going to focus on a few of those that are more near term, and we're going to try to quantify them about what we would need and what we need to bring. And I think that will be helpful for you on IRPs because you can make sure that your companies are bringing in those attributes that they're going to need by location. So, but yeah, so we have a litany. Frequency is definitely one of them. Voltage support is one of them. Minimum ramp time, minimum uptime, minimum downtime. There's a number of them that we're looking at today, and I think we are going to narrow it down some for the ones that we need more more near term versus long term.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, one other question. As we watch Missouri migrate to more renewables and see more retirements, how many megawatts of those peakers are we going to need online? Do you have a sense of where that's going?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't see the screen.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think that you're going to need, somebody's going to need to make up the gap with some flexible resources. And I think if you look at your gap in 2027, so the slide that's above that one, you do have a lot of wind and solar in there. I think the attributes would be potentially making that up with some gas peaking units might be helpful. And it doesn't have to be Ameren necessarily. It could be, somebody else in your footprint. You do have others in your footprint. But I think over the long term, we're looking at hoping resources with those different attributes show up somewhere. And Missouri might be the place they show up. They might be your neighbor. But again, if you look at slide 7, we don't have any really in the queue right now. So a little concerning. And besides gas, and I know gas is an emission free, but besides gas, we just don't have any other options right now to provide some of those attributes that we're going to need going forward. So I think in the short term, we're going to need some type of gas asset in the footprint to that we can rely on going forward that replaces some of the coal that's retiring.
Got a sense of how many megawatts that might be? 50, 100, 500?
I think in the futures we had a fourth of our assets. So we did a renewable, our future based on what our members' plans were, and then we had to fill in the gaps with gas assets. And I think it was a fourth or more of the assets we had to, the model picked were gas assets to meet the peak demand of the 124. So if you think about what the peak demand is, I think it's like 120,000 or 120 gigawatts. And about a fourth of that, if not a little bit more, were gas assets that we were having to slot in to meet those obligations going forward.
Okay. Any other questions in the room?
Mr. Chairman.
Yep. Commissioner, proceed.
Sorry, I got a couple follow-ups after that. So how does distributed generation factor into this? I heard you say you might be able to use your neighbors. If I know that you've got nameplate on the size of the systems that you have, if every single home in Missouri put a solar system on their house, would that capacity then be transferred through the utility to count for some of the shortfall?
Yeah, so distributed generation is usually a negative on the load right now because it's not really a generator that, in most instances, it's a distributed resource that we can count on and use as a generator, as negative to load. So demand side management, distributed generation, all of that comes in where it lowers your load forecast. And it shows that you have that. We can't see a lot of that right now, and we're trying to change that. So we can't actually see, like, if the sun's out and the load drops over the system because everybody has solar on it, it looks like a reduction in load to us. Unless we get visibility to that, we're not able to see that. And then when the cloud comes over and all the load picks up, we're actually going to need more flexibility to be able to manage that more distributed generation. But it does look like a reduction in load today. So it would reduce the overall requirement that you have to meet.
Okay, and then how does that play in with demand response?
Yeah. So demand response can participate in the market as a resource that we can use in an emergency. So we can access our demand response, whether it be an industrial turning off equipment or some kind of load control program on air conditioners. All of that can bid into our resource adequacy market as a load modifying resource, and we can use it in an emergency. So we can't access those unless we're in a certain level of emergency situation. But they do get capacity credit as part of our, and they are in, the ones that we have in today are part of that survey that you saw. So if a utility or a load serving entity or generator came up and said they have demand response, that was included in as capacity in those two charts that you saw for 23 and 27.
So the greens and the blue lines that would appear to be a fairly bleak situation as far as capacity goes, they already factor in demand response.
They do. If the load serving entity or the generator put it in the survey as a resource they were going to use. So it's usually existing demand response that's in there. When I looked at it, I could see demand response resources being one of the resources that was included. If you did new demand response resources that aren't in the survey, they'd be additive to this, but the existing ones have been included as a resource in that survey.
Okay, my last question is what is the sort of consequence of running this deficit for the state of Missouri? I mean, you show your one slide where 1,200 megawatts underperforming, I suppose, or lack of capacity. What happens if that doesn't fix itself or it continues to grow?
So Missouri itself being deficit may not be an issue if everybody else is in a surplus, because we are a mutual insurance pool with all of the other states. So
Assuming the transmission
yeah.
is there.
And assuming that the transmission is there. So you have to meet your local requirements, but your local requirements are pretty low. And so you usually meet them with all of your resources that you have in the market. So if everybody else is long and you're short, they transfer power. There's no issue. That's what we do, and we've done it for years, and it's no big deal. The issue that happened this year is we had three zones that didn't have enough resources inside the zone that needed transfers, but we didn't have enough excess to transfer. So that means that we shift our risk from a 1 day in 10 situation to something else. And this was 1 day in 5.6, one in 5.6 days. So our risk profile changes. It means that today, it means that the price of that capacity goes all the way to the cost of new entry. So it's expensive. So what Missouri would have to do if it had load serving entities that didn't have enough power, they would have to buy at that high price, which means that the customers eventually would be paying a higher price for the capacity. And it just makes our risk profile change over time. So that's why it's important to look and see what everybody's doing, kind of get a view that we're trying to get you of what all the other states, all the other zones are doing too. Because again, Missouri, it's not necessarily a bad thing to go in and not have enough capacity if there is enough capacity in the overall MISO market to buy. I mean, that's not a problem, because you can, a little bit short is, you can rely on your neighbors to get it. It's when others are in the same position and there's not enough oversupply to meet those requirements on the system as a whole. So that's the risk we run.
So does MISO interact with state legislatures to address capacity issue? Because at the commission, we're a regulatory enforcement body of the existing statute, and I'm just curious if there's communication between yourself and state legislatures that in the states that control the policy side of this.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will tell you that we don't actively go to the legislature and request to have conversations about resource adequacy, but we're often asked to come in. So over the last 2 months, I would say 2 to 3 months, I've been in 4 state legislatures talking about resource adequacy because they are looking at legislation, or they enacted legislation that's going to impact resource adequacy. So I've been in 4 state legislatures talking about the situation, and they've asked questions about what they could do differently to help the situation, depending on where they were sitting in the legislature. So If asked, we will definitely come in and have conversations with legislatures. It's usually ones that are thinking about doing something on the energy side for legislation, and they're just interested in how they could create a law that could help the situation. So,
do you have a suggestion of how states can approach improving their capacity without, short of stopping a retirement?
No, we didn't provide any definite suggestions, but we talked about the impacts of the retirements on their overall reliability. And depending on the legislature, and some of the legislatures were enacting more clean requirements, like Illinois, CEJA, is one of the most, and they asked about how their legislation, which retires all the coal and gas in their entire state, is going to impact resource adequacy. So we could give them ideas and information about how their state alone, given its legislation, might have issues with not having any of these resources be there in the next 10 to 20 years. So it's more specific to the legislation they're thinking about and the questions they ask. We don't normally go in and have kind of a blueprint about what they should be doing related to resources, because it's kind of different depending on where your state sits.
Thank you. Great information. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay. Any other commissioner questions or questions in the room? Okay. Thank you very much.
All right,
It's
thank
very
you.
enlightening. Appreciate the open line of communication that we always have with you guys.
Yeah, thanks.
So thank you for that. That just leaves us with scheduling, and then we'll get out of here. So first up, today is the on-the-record presentation of staff's investigation of matters concerning the Rush Island Energy Center belonging to Ameren. That begins as soon as we're done here down in room 310, and I think we'll dovetail nicely into that conversation we just had. Thursday, August 18th is going to be a special agenda at 2 p.m. So that's tomorrow at 2. We'll have a special agenda on, I believe it's the Liberty securitization. Wednesday, August 24th, we have agenda at 10:15 a.m. Monday, August 29th through Friday, September 9th, we have an evidentiary hearing in ER 2022-0129. That's Evergy Metro's request for authority to implement a general rate increase for electric service. That will be in room 310 at 9 a.m. with Judge Hatcher. Wednesday, August 31st, we have agenda at 10:15 a.m. Monday, September 5th is a state holiday. Wednesday, September 7th, agenda at 10:15 a.m. Sunday, September 11th through Wednesday, September 14th is the NOC 2022 Summit. Monday, September 12th is a local public hearing in WA 2022-0311. That's Missouri American Water Company's application for a CCN in and around the city of Stewartsville. That will be via WebEx only at 6 p.m. with Judge Hatcher. And then finally, Wednesday, September 14th, agenda is at 10:15 a.m. So that gets us out through the middle of September. Any comments, questions, or requests regarding scheduling? All right, hearing none and with no other business coming before the body, we will stand adjourned. Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Downstairs for the on the right.